So first, we just want to introduce the Inside Outside Project as a, excuse me, work that's happening between Liberation Road, Committees for Correspondence, Democracy for Socialism. I messed up their name, but CCDS is the short version. DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, the Communist Party USA, and Left Roots. I am Whitney Maxey, she, her. I am on the National Executive Committee of Liberation Road and a member of the editorial team of the Organizing Upgrade Collective. And Rishi Awatramani is my beautiful co-moderator, who is a Roots and also an editor with Organizing Upgrade. We wanted to have this conversation because it actually started pre-COVID. We just wanted to come into 2020 knowing that it would be a huge electoral year. There was so much at stake already with the kind of gains and momentum that have been happening among the left electoral movement. We had what was sure to be a showdown with whoever emerged from the Democratic Party and Trump, as well as key parts of the right on state and local tickets. You know, we knew we had census, right? 2020 was already a high stakes year. And then to ratchet that up, there was this global pandemic that has exposed and exacerbated existing crises that existed in the economy, ecologically, as well as the political legitimacy of the United States, both internally and externally. And then if that wasn't enough, right, we had the murder of George Floyd that sparked this new wave of resistance and uprising among not just Black activists, but these really broad parts of the United States that are kind of multi-class and multiracial and multi-gender in nature. So we set out wanting to have a discussion with 3 people that we knew were doing just really powerful state work, and also have been thinking about and putting into action these questions around electoral strategy and how we can kind of respond to moments like these when, in terms of trying to center or still center electoral politics, because that can often be a struggle, right? Things are popping off in the streets and folks are just thinking, I just want to stay in the streets. Like, I don't know what's happening over there with my whoever, my city council, the county commission, whoever it is. I just want to do this thing. And so we wanted to kind of shift the focus of the conversation some to talk about, well, how do we think about the relationships between these mass protests, organizing, and electoral work? So to help us do that today, we have Sochie Nnaemeka, she, her, the director of New York Working Families Party. We have Kristian Hernandez, she, her, National Political Committee of Democratic Socialists of America. And we have, excuse me, Sendolo Diaminah, he, him, and she, her, co-director of Carolina Federation. So before I jump us off into the discussion, I do just want to take a moment to give some appreciation to all the people who have made this call possible. So first, who is on tech support for this call are Ben Allen and Mary Jo Connolly, both from Liberation Road. We have Rosana Cabron, who's the co-chair of CPUSA. Rosana will be monitoring the chat to pull out questions because we'll be doing some Q&A from attendee questions towards the end of this call. And then our digital bouncer, if you will, is Sam Lewis from the Democratic Socialists of America. So first question is directed at Sochie. So Sochie, there are a plethora of people, right, and just different groups that are springing into action as a result of the COVID crises in this most recent kind of anti-state violence upsurge. Who are you focused on engaging in this election, and what is the thinking behind your decision?
Cool, thank you, Whitney. Hi, folks, good evening. Thanks for having us. So we've been seeing major mobilizations happening in this moment, whether they are protests and demonstrations against austerity budgets and the kind of oncoming cuts, whether they are protests in response to decades of police violence, and whether they are like non-explicitly political mobilizations like to unemployment lines in pursuit of social services, towards mutual aid sites and food banks. And our job fundamentally, I think, in the work we're trying to do in New York is to center, bring in, and then politicize all of the conversations that people are having about the ways in which the political status quo is failing us, right? So people who are mobilizing to in search of food at food pantries, what does it say about the failed response of the state in this moment? For people who are mobilizing against police brutality, what does it mean about a lack of political will on behalf of your elected officials? And so we have been trying to, in many ways, rush to keep up with the very real radical demands of the movement, whether formally named as such or not, have been making on the political leadership, and connecting that real rage, grief, and hope into political demands. And so the timing in some ways was a beautiful thing, right? People, we are deep at the epicenter of crisis in New York, and we have people and decision makers on the line, right? And so there's both not a temporal disconnect between the urgency, the crisis, and then the opportunity to call leadership into question, but also there's not this kind of intellectual disconnect. Voters are very clear that our experience in New York is based on a lack of political will and a response to the crisis that we're in. Voters are clear that establishment Democrats are putting out short-termism, like piecemeal patchwork, incremental solutions to like the biggest crisis potentially of our generation. And so it is our job to connect the dots. And so who we're centering are these new formations of the essential worker, right, of frontline workers. We need to expand the title of such, right? Who is on the front lines? Parents who have no childcare on the front lines, people who have no jobs and are not sure whether their job or their category will ever come back, like, are on the front lines. So there's very much a narrative shift that's necessary to say that we, the Working Families Party, are the party of the front lines. You, the person who the political class is not responding to, are on the front lines, and how do we then move in unity and connect the grief that we're experiencing in our communities to real political demands. And so that's parents, that's young people, that is gig workers that are the undocumented, that are pushed out and have no cash assistance. It is our job to coalesce this group and to center them as a political force.
That's really helpful, Sochie. Thank you. That's a great place for us to start. In Sendolo, I want to see if you can pick up on some similar themes, because, Sochie points us in the direction of, there's a failed crisis response, possibly leading to, a big narrative opportunity for us to sort of name a crisis of legitimacy that folks are in, and then build a broader coalition than we've been able to build before. So there's a debate right now. The left is full of debates, but one contemporary debate is about whether or not this is a moment where we can actually remake the sort of political coalition we need to achieve our long-term vision, right? Some folks are like, no, it's a hyper-partisan moment. We know where people fall, and it's just a question of turning out at the polls in November, right? It's just a question of getting Black and brown voters to the polls, our base voters, right? And other folks are like, well, that's important, but it's also, this moment actually has people shifting ideologically in a lot of ways. There's people who are in favor of what we might consider left politics, racial justice politics, for the first time in a long time. So I guess I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that debate a bit, right? Like, is this, from the experience of the Federation, is this an opportunity for expanding the coalition, or is this a turnout moment primarily? And the temptation will always be to say yes, and we shouldn't create a false distinction. But I'm wondering if you have a sense of whether it's more one than the other.
Yeah, great question, and glad to be on with all of y'all. I was thinking about this contradiction because the Carolina Federation concretely has to wrestle with this in terms of who we focus on in our electoral work for North Carolina in the fall of this year. And where we have really been orienting is let's start and let's focus with a primary base of working class people and people of color, right? Like that's where we need to begin. And I think one of the things that we've seen this year is that the potential of those folks to go into action, both in terms of protest and in terms of elections, is massive. And our organizational infrastructure to create the compelling structures, relationships, strategies, and stories for those people to get engaged is not where it needs to be to capture that full potential. So for us, as the left, I think that's different than the whole anti-right united front. Let me just point that out. But as the left, I think we have a unique contribution to make to go deep and go hard among that base of people who share a lot of our values in politics, but aren't seeing the political vehicles or aren't having the relationships that can bring them into the political vehicles that we need. So I think that's where the emphasis has to be. And, you know, 4 years ago in the last round of uprisings with the Movement for Black Lives, I was like, oh, this is the moment. Like, this is the opportunity. We have to seize this. And I think what we've been seeing over time is that we're actually in a period of consistent uprisings. They rise and they fall, but the pace of them has just been picking up. The intensity has been picking up. And I think we're in for a decade of intense upsurges. And so I don't think we should relate to this as the only opportunity where we can start engaging and reaching out to people whose lives are being shifted by what's going on. I think it is one opportunity. That said, for us in North Carolina, we know we have to move people who aren't already with us on a lot of political issues, and this is a moment where we want to be experimenting. And so I think one thing that comrades could think about is not both and as a way to escape the situation, but literally like which resources, which targets, which numbers for the both and. And so we're still thinking through exactly what our stuff will look like, but the emphasis is on our base. And then there's a question of where do we experiment to try to move people? And the experiments are smaller than the massive investment that we're making with our base, but it's not, we don't need those people. We don't need to explore that question because in the next cycle, we're going to need to know something about how did those conversations go? And how do we then use that as a foundation for the next layer?
Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this. It's definitely a, well, hello everyone. Pardon the y'alls, I will probably say y'all quite a lot in case there was any doubt who the Texan was in the room. Yeah, I mean, I think with DSA, we're in a position to where the highest decision-making body, which is our membership at our annual or biannual convention, voted that Bernie Sanders was going to be the only presidential candidate that we would endorse and support. And so I think that puts us in a place to where we're figuring out what it means to engage with this moment, both not the uprising, but also November and all of that in the midst of a pandemic, which is not something that anybody is by any means an expert on, and we're sort of all trying to navigate the moment. Our national director likes to say we're often like building the plane as we're flying it, and it requires a lot of flexibility. It requires being nimble in our approach and in our strategy. And I think with DSA, obviously, when we saw Bernie's campaign be suspended, it provided us an opportunity to reach out to people who were looking for a political home. And we were able to bring in, I think, over 10,000 new members, once Bernie suspended his campaign, and they were pretty reflective of the coalition that he, had his campaign founded on, which was very, very young, very Black and brown, and it was it was something that we had to move quickly on. It wasn't something that was going to wait for us, and I think often, when you're moving quickly, it can be really easy to sort of let other outside forces either water down your politics or sort of create a lot of variables to where you're sort of trying to navigate and make the correct decision. But I think ultimately, really focusing on rooting yourself in your lane almost, because I think that the presidential election does provide an opportunity for the widest coalition possible. And even if it's not formalized, I think that each of us being able to really excel at the work that we're already doing, I think will kind of create this like ecosystem that can hopefully, bring about the correct organizing conditions for us to really be able to navigate the pandemic and whatever administration comes from, November, in a way that it causes the least amount of harm to the communities that we're engaged with. Because I think ultimately that is what it's going to be, is us really deepening the relationships that we have, and the ones that we're sort of looking to build, because that sense of community, that trust is really what's going to get us through whatever comes our way.
Great. Yeah, so first I want to say, Kristian, please say all the y'alls. So you and I are anchoring the Southern aspect of this panel, Southern born, Southern raised. But I want to keep it on you, Kristian, because actually a thing that you're touching on is kind of where I would love the conversation to go next. So with DSA's, recent milestone around reaching up approximately 70,000 members, and obviously seeing that spike that you talked about after the Bernie race. I'm wondering, in your view, who should DSA be focused on moving to the polls, recruiting into organization, and how y'all think about that question of relating to the left, which I know you began to speak on in the previous response, but I just kind of want to hear you expand on that a little more.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our chapters are really focusing on the type of work that they've already been doing, and sort of just having to adjust that work, with social distancing and staying protected and staying safe. And so I think by the fact that we're able to have so many chapters that are doing, tenant organizing is super important, given that most people are, wondering how they're going to pay rent tomorrow, that we have people who are doing immigration related work, and tying the fact that here in, I think actually countrywide, 70% of deportations happen because of police interactions. So that's a way to tie in to the current moment of us talking about centering Black liberation and specifically defunding the police. It's super important for us to be able to somewhat reorient our work, but still continue doing that work, because it's super necessary, and none of those issues have changed because of the pandemic or even because of the uprisings. I think even the uprisings have only sort of shown the contradictions and the disparity that we've been aiming to highlight for a long time on the left. And so I think, like I spoke to earlier, obviously Bernie supporters were somewhat of a somewhat of a natural, like, hey, you like democratic socialism, there's a very large socialist organization that you should look into, which is seems like the natural next step, but isn't always, right? Like there's still the work required to reach out to people, to build relationships with those communities. And so I think ultimately being able to reach out to people who completely are both disenfranchised or just really hate the current political system and refuse to engage with either the Democratic or the Republican Party, who don't see the value in electoral work even, and being able to sort of cast as wide a net as possible of like, hey, these are different doors of opportunity for you to come into DSA. And I think obviously right now we're also focused on building up the leadership within our organization, really focused on solidarity work, specifically with Black and Brown communities, because I think, any revolution is going to be led by these communities. And so being able to really do that work, that really deep organizing work that often, no one really sees and isn't as visible in the midst of elections, is really the only work that's going to get us through the highs and lows that come with electoral politics.
That's great, thank you. And I'm curious for Sochie and Sendolo, one of the things that Kristian talked about was this opening towards socialism, right? That is very much characteristic of this moment. Even if what people are calling socialism, there's a broad spectrum of what that means. There's a greater openness towards alternative ideas and alternative ways of doing things that there wasn't before. And so there is this kind of like trying to navigate the current landscape as the left through these different organizations, when many of us were a part of organizing, even just in the early 2000s, right? In the 2000s, where the kinds of attacks, not even necessarily just red baiting, but just the kind of stigma and stuff that was around ideas of socialism were very much prevalent. And so I'm just wondering how y'all are kind of orienting to this moment where you have these new layers of people, and even in some cases existing layers of people that are just more open to kind of socialist or just broad left ideas.
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. So I think we definitely have seen, at least in New York, a real like leftward tilt of our electoral base. People have a greater appetite for left policy. We have candidates who are running with far clearer left platforms, right? We have just elected Jamal Bowman to Congress, right, in New York. Yes, a fantastic community-rooted Black left candidate, right, who comes out of the education justice world, who comes out of the parent world, et cetera, and who spoke very clearly and openly about the revolutionary origins, right, or roots of his platform. So I think there's that appetite. I think what we found in New York, not just in this moment, but last year, as we're seeing budget cuts even before COVID, is that people are already having this people are returning to a common sense framework, right? People are recognizing the ways in which the world as it is constructed does not make sense. People are having, and the part of the electoral strategy we had was to have conversations with people about, does it actually make sense that your neighbor does not have healthcare, right, because of immigration status or because of lack of employment? And what is it, and does it, like, what benefit does it bring you for you to have healthcare when the person who is, who is going to school with your child or who lives in the adjacent house does not, right? Like having actually very values-based, like ideologically driven conversations as you're trying to move people on electoral or political decisions. We found that people were quite open to that because people were seeing the deep fractures in our society and the systems that was created, right? The precarity of our healthcare system that was revealed as corporate hospitals were receiving bailouts in this moment, and hospitals somehow did not have money for PPE. Like people were dumbstruck that this is actually how our society is organized. And so I think in this moment, never taking advantage of opportunities or failing to take advantage of opportunities for political education and weaving that into something as short and tight as an electoral rap on the phones and moving people to make decisions, making ideologically based decisions for their political action. That was the type of program that we need to run. We need to continue to run because people were really shifting. People were open, and people were trying to construct this narrative for themselves, or reconstruct a narrative of what kind of America we live in. And it was really our job to kind of fill in the gaps. So I think that there is a huge appetite and energy, and there's a lot of political education that needs to happen, and that needs to not exist in another phase, but it has to be woven into all of our political programs.
Whitney and Rishi, I'm going to say a few things and help direct me towards a sharper thing if I'm veering some. But a lot of what I've been thinking about is how someone like AOC, right, is able to articulate a socialist politic, but at the same time put out a program or a programmatic framework like the Green New Deal that provides this bridge between someone who's developed a specific ideological perspective and the kind of broad value and questioning stuff that Sochie is talking about, right? And to me, I think there's a moment for both things to be happening. And I think it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's been somewhat surprising, and the further the door opens to people openly talking about socialism, I'm surprised every single time, and I'm like, oh, this is great, all right, let's go. I have to admit that I was politicized and I was raised by people who are much more cautious, so I'm still like, y'all, we still supposed to do that? Okay, let's try it. It's still a thing that I have to wrestle with myself about, but there's so much excitement around it, and I found among the people who are like, I want to commit my life, or at least this period of my time, to really doing this political work, I need an ideological framework to give me the ground to help navigate, I think, what Kristian was talking about, these ups and downs of the electoral system, the sense of like, why are we allying in some moments with establishment Democrats against the right? How do I make sense of that? How do I make sense of the fact I'm trying to move someone who has homophobic or racist ideas over into a progressive politic in our wider bloc? How do I hold all those things together? And what are we fighting for the long term? I think to navigate what we're facing, so many people are longing for a specific socialist theoretical and ideological tradition. And at the same time, I think there's a wider range of people who aren't necessarily like, I'm looking for an ideological tradition or a specific ideological organization to join. I want to be part of a broader movement, and I can get down with the kind of things like the Green New Deal was putting out. I'm excited and motivated by that. So to me, there's kind of layers of political education and engagement that I think we could be doing right now.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Sendolo. You know, I mean, I think, yeah, there's on the one hand, there's like, where do we give people tradition and training and depth of thinking? And there's a piece of it that's just on us of like, how do we allow contradictions into our movement? Like being broad means the people that are not deeply steeped and have a coherent system of thought around liberation are going to be welcomed in. And some of it's the work we got to do in our organizations to be ready for that. Which brings us to our next question. Sochie, I want to come back to you. So, you know, New York Working Families is going to have a lot of experience with this, but what is the role of unions and the labor movement in this moment, right? So, you know, when labor is militant and strong, you know, it has incredible leverage that it can use to make change. Often labor runs afoul of sort of leading social movements, non-labor leading social movements, racial justice movements. You know, it's a mixed bag. But your organization has dealt with kind of all of the best and worst of that in New York, and there's been some big fights around that recently. But I guess I'm wondering if you can say, what do you think labor's role is in 2020?
So I will start from the perspective, right, of New York, right? New York is the most unionized state in the country. I don't see a path to left power without organized labor in New York. And so it is absolutely imperative that we figure out how to have deep left alignment with the labor movement. I feel like in this moment, right, what we're seeing right now is a potential like austerity response to the crisis we're in that's going to hit labor really hard. What we're seeing right now is a crisis of care that is only going to deepen. We're seeing that nurses are kind of rated right through public polls the most trusted messengers in our society right now. I think for us, we have to figure out with labor alongside, how do we both reshape our economy to center care that we desperately need, and how do we make sure that we have a united front against austerity and kind of neoliberal politics, in particular in New York, coming from our state executive, right, coming from the governor, that is completely eroding any social welfare state that we have. I think that there is a hunger and an eagerness within the labor movement to figure out how to realign, because the marriage between the kind of close alliance between the labor movement and corporate Democrats has a expiration date. And we're going to see it come up. We're going to see it come up pretty quickly. Our role right now, we need to build more deeply with labor members, right? Which I know DSA and the party is trying to do more deeply. We need to do more work of multi-year long-term visioning with labor leadership, right? Like, what is our 5-year plan? What is our 10-year plan? What is our response to our care crisis and to our climate crisis? How do we push back against rolling cuts on healthcare and education? And in New York, what we've found is labor and some number of left electeds are willing, for example, to call for increased for real taxes on the wealthy, right? To get out of this crisis that we're in, we need to actually be pushing massive pressure to ensure that the 118 billionaires in New York State are not the only ones who get a ride out of this crisis okay, which right now the framework allows them, right? Profits are surging. Amazon is pulling in money hand over fist, and who is, the risk, all the risk is flowing down to the working people. And so we have to make that point clear. We have to figure out if this is a moment really to force the fissure, to force the division between labor and corporate Dems in our state, between labor and a very, very powerful governor, probably the most powerful governor in the history of New York State since Rockefeller. We have to really call the question, figure out, are we actually, do we have the same kind of 5-year, 10-year, 20-year orientation towards a North Star in which New York is actually a place where working people can thrive? If we do, perhaps there's opportunity for short-term losses on labor side. That is not an easy conversation. I'm not pretending that that is a conversation I've slated for tomorrow afternoon. But there's clearly, as we're saying, there's a deep appetite to reshape the economy, to bring working people into a body politic, a new body politic, to not have workers and Black people be completely taken for granted on a ride with Democrats when we know that their policies don't serve us. And so I think this is like one of the most urgent questions, but I'm sure that we cannot actually move forward as United Left Front without labor at the table.
Sendolo, do you want to try to jump in on that in terms of, like, from the perspective of a right to work state, what that looks like for you all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I think that if we can't take over and transform our unions, how are we going to take over and transform the country? And in the same way, I think we need to be strategic about which unions when. And in our state, it has been really, really important that there are people who have deep multiracial transformative politics who said, we want to transform our state teachers union, and organized for 7 years to win leadership, not just say some things and see if we're going to win, but systematically, local by local, say, how do we actually listen to what's going on to working people in these areas, and then build a program that inspires people year after year, that, by the way, combines mass mobilization, shutting down schools when it's time to fight, as well as sometimes being in alliance with our local superintendents, right, in relationship to the state legislature. That back and forth negotiation in every building, conversations. I think we need to think about labor as a terrain, labor institutions as a terrain that we must retake in order to be able to have the instruments for leading our people more broadly. I do not think that means that every single labor institution has the same balance of forces within it, and that we should treat labor as one monolithic entity. I think in every state, we need to do an assessment. Which institutions are ones that we think we could transform, and if we transformed them, they would be able to decisively make a change in what's happening in our state, in the labor movement, or with masses of working people. So I think we need to look at it as one part of the terrain that we have to take over.
I'll just add just one thing that I think will say, in terms of the analysis, like our power analysis, right? Labor, even though it has been weakened across the country and in New York State, still has the most genuinely working class base, like bigger genuinely working class base than any organization on the left, right? Like we have to recognize that. I completely agree with Sendolo that we have to do like deep alignment work to shift labor to properly embrace transformational politics in some ways. But the starting ingredient for any successful left project, I think, has to, we have to figure out how to organize the biggest working class base on our side, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think that's been our experience in Texas, obviously not having a super high union density, and sort of knowing the limitations of the existing labor, say, terrain in Texas. And I think initially when I started out organizing, I was, frustrated by this idea that unions were sort of just backing incumbents and just the tried and true. And it didn't feel like they were really going for like the bold progressives or even the leftists, frankly. And so there's been a definite shift in the way that unions are willing to sort of enter the terrain of politics with, I think in Texas, we saw that recently with Jessica Cisneros and Heidi Sloan, and that those endorsements, were not really something that would have been heard of even a few years ago. I think you're seeing that with like, the AFL I know is doing some work around immigration with citizenship workshops. And locally we had, the United Auto Workers and Unite Here, that both have been, had done a lot of work to advance a lot of radical messaging. The idea that one job should be enough, that healthcare is a human right. And I think currently, we're working with AFT, which is our local teachers union, because they're spearheading the fight for raises for support staff who are essentially, the essential workers that are currently, I think Time did an article on them. And of course, now they're facing like having to beg for, a very small raise, which is just ridiculous. And the AFT is also working to push to get SROs, so cops out of schools, as well as ICE. And so I think that we're definitely seeing that, like, we know the potential of unions, especially like as kind of overhauling both the leadership, but also just like the radicalize the very nature of the people within the unions to sort of push for more, and not only push for more, but like make them that we deserve more. And I think that's possible as long as we were really focused on organizing, because unions provide the opportunity of having multiple sites of struggle, and really I agree with the point about like this is a truly multiracial base that we could really help support and strengthen through a lot of these issue-based campaigns that are happening both currently and like in the future. And so I think we also need to stay grounded as the fact that we're not only living on stolen land, but also stolen labor. And so there's also no robust labor movement without the Black liberation movement. And I think that's something that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds, especially right now during the uprising.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. So transform labor when we can, where we can. We're going to put that on a t-shirt, sell it in our store. I'm just kidding, people. There's no store. But Kristian, I want to transition us a little bit, because each of you in some way has touched on some kind of relationship with or run into the Democratic Party. And so I'm wondering, how are you balancing the need to fight the right and challenge the centrist Dems? And, how does that look like in your state in particular in terms of the organizing work that you're doing? And what's the kind of, what's the shape of that struggle?
I mean, I think that there's this assumption that we need to first fight the right, and then we fight the centrist, and then we win. But I don't necessarily see it that way. I think that these things are happening simultaneously. We're both, I think in Texas, it can kind of feel like we're fighting from like all angles. We have, the Tea Party, and then the far right, and then, the fascists, and then we have centrists, and then we have like, I think even often like there's a lack of some boldness from progressives in Texas as well. And so on the left, we're sort of in our early stages of both running and winning elections. We have, Franklin Bynum in Houston, who's a judge, and Greg Casar in Austin, who's a DSA member. That's really been at the forefront of so much of the big fights in Austin, including paid sick, and now with the city budget. And so I think we're seeing the need to run explicitly socialist candidates, especially in Texas, because there hasn't been any sort of backlash, honestly, whenever I've done any type of electoral work of like, oh, you're a socialist, like I'm not going to listen to you. We've been talking about Medicare for all, which is broadly supported, and in Texas, where we're the most underinsured and uninsured state in the country, and where Medicare for all covers people who don't have status, like that's an issue that resonates with so many people. And so being able to really speak to, I'm sorry, my cat just jumped up here. I knew that was going to happen. We're able to speak to a broader base of people. I think that's important. And I think that that's something that we're really hoping that with pushing for really bold issue-based campaigns, that we're able to challenge both, centrists and progressives alike to really kind of push the boundaries of the realm of the possible in Texas specifically, but also acknowledging that the right is definitely very much a threat, and we also have to protect whatever gains that we've made. And I think that's going to be a real issue even in November. We saw that recently with elections of voter suppression and closing polling locations, and just how long it took even on Super Tuesday to go vote. And so I think that we also have to be thinking about the ways that we can engage with electoral politics that doesn't necessarily adhere to a specific party, but really to the very nature of what it means to go vote, and what it means to actually have a democratic process. And so I think a lot of that is really making politics real for people, demystifying a lot of the process, just demystifying what it takes to confront power, who is in power, who is making these decisions, and really being able to bring that into every facet of people's lives is something that I think we face as the left, is how to make it just very apparent to people. And I do think that we are living in a moment of clarity where the ills of capitalism are really at the forefront of everyday things, and we're really deciding what we will and won't put up with. And so I think obviously every state, all of our chapters are sort of assessing the moment as far as what their relationship will be to the party and how they're going to run candidates. But ultimately, we know running socialist candidates that were tried and true and came from DSA is ultimately the way that we're going to be able to build socialist governance, and actually have the accountability that I think is often talked about in the electoral realm, to where we're actually able to get candidates to meet demands and not just sort of say the right things, but not actually bring those things into fruition once they're in office.
Sendolo, can you come in to talk about this question too? Kristian gave this really, very concrete, rich answer to this question of relationship with the Democrats. And I really appreciate it, because sometimes the sort of question about how to relate to the Dems slips into historical abstraction very quickly about sort of role of the party, et cetera. And, the question of how to relate to the Dems varies just widely depending on where you are, right? And so, I know from my work in Virginia, it was a very specific question to ask it in Virginia, because it wasn't like there was a strong left. It wasn't like there was strong community organization all over the state. We had a very specific set of things we had to face when I was working over there. And similarly in North Carolina, the conditions are very specific. In state, how do you and the Federation sort of view this question of how to relate to the party, both in terms of the party structure, party elites within the party, but all the sort of grass tops sort of activists inside the party, and also in terms of how does your base relate to the party? Is it a strong relationship, and how do you confront that?
Yeah. So I want to start with a really concrete piece with COVID, right? Our governor, who's a Democratic governor, who is part of our fight back against the right's control of our state, came out with policies around quarantine, right? And then has been getting pushback from the right and is trying to navigate what do I do and what do I say in the context of 2020 as an election year to try to maintain veto power relative to the Republicans who have control of our state legislature, right? So he's navigating that. Then at the same time, right, like he's not moving forward things around eviction moratoriums, like strong ones, permanent long-term ones, in the way that our people are wanting and desiring. Like that's really true. And we have to make an assessment. Are we going to go after the governor on those things? And what would that cost us? And there's costs at all different levels, right? Like what would it cost if it meant like fracturing the United Front that we needed to get him elected, which is also connected to the United Front that we need to defeat the senator, right, for Congress? There's real costs for us there. There are also real costs for us for not taking the rage, the anger, the righteous positions around these pieces with some of our people who are feeling that and are wanting to get into that fight. So I don't think it's a simple contradiction. I don't think it's a simple thing to hold where you're just like, oh, you just do these things in every single circumstance. Our assessment is that we have not pushed towards, and really we haven't got a strong push from our membership. I think it might be different if everybody was clamoring, be like, we must do this. But we haven't gotten a strong push from our membership to be like, the governor is the main target, right? And we think it is useful to have an assessment of who is the main enemy in a moment. And then inside of that context, for us, the main enemy is the right. That doesn't mean we never have a fight with establishment Democrats. That doesn't mean we never have a fight with moderate Democrats. I'm going to reveal some of my roots in the Chinese revolutionary tradition. And Mao had this saying where he was like, within the United Front, we only fight allies on just grounds, to our advantage, and with restraint. And I think those pieces are really important. On just grounds means that if we take on an establishment Democrat, the vast majority of our base are going to be like, yeah, y'all should have done that because he was whack. Two, right, to our advantage, we don't take on fights that we're not going to win. It is not helpful for our people for us to just go running out to be like, well, he's wrong on this and that, which may or may not be true. But if we get our butts whooped, people are going to be like, right, that's why I'll never work with the left because they'll never win. So to our advantage. And then with restraint means that we fight them when there's a specific fight to have with them, and then we go back to our main fight against the right. And to us, that doesn't mean compromising our values or telling lies to our people of like, oh yeah, all these Democrats are for us. No, that doesn't mean that we have to tell those lies, but it does mean that we have to talk with our people about what it means to be on a battlefield of class struggle and the struggle against white supremacy, and that there is a range of allies, some of whom will stab us in the back as soon as they get a chance. That doesn't mean they're not part of the alliance. It means they're a part of the alliance that we have to have a sophisticated relationship to. The last thing I want to say about that is it means that we have to actually talk about the Democrats in a much more sophisticated way. And this is going to be a refrain for me. I don't think there's a monolith here. And when we say the Democratic Party, what we're really talking about is a party label, a ballot line, that then different organizations relate to and jockey for control over. So there's groupings of funders, there's groupings of the House caucus, the Senate caucus, the institutions that really control the re-election of elected officials, right? Those are different institutions. There are different policy and polling groups, and we need to be able to map what actually is the Democratic Party in your state. What is the range of institutions that contest within it? And then what are the relationships of different bases to those people? I think for our folks, there's this combo where the people who are consistent voters on the progressive side have a strong attachment to that party label. Democrat is how they get their basic first cut. Are you for us or are you against us? You can't go out here and be like, we ain't no Democrats, and have the consistent voters trust who you are. But then we have people who we want to bring into the political process who are like, we do not trust Democrats. We don't trust Democrats, we don't trust Republicans, we don't trust none of y'all, and you knocking on our door too, who are you? So that group of people, I don't think has a strong tie to the Democratic Party. But I don't think that means that they are just waiting for another group to come in. I think there's a deep cynicism about politics as a vehicle for transformation. So there's work on both sides in terms of moving people who have the attachment to the party label and maybe deeply disturbed by some challenge that we bring and are afraid that we will fracture the Democratic coalition. We need to be able to struggle with those folks in our base, as well as bring in people who have questions about the electoral process as a whole.
That's excellent. Lots to mull over there, Sendolo. And I think we probably need more debate about whether sort of fundamentally the party's ballot line and then there's sort of institutions set up to conquer the ballot line. It's a good point of departure for debate. But Sochie, I think we can't move on from this discussion without bringing you in, because you're party building, right? Y'all are party building for an independent party. So, you know, the left has sort of long dreamed that it needs its own party. It's going to have its own party. People don't always mean the same thing by that when they say that, but nonetheless, you know, there's, and, you know, people sort of want a party that could be a sort of mass electoral expression. Some people want it to be sort of like a left building expression. And, you know, we've squandered a lot of opportunities to build that organization, and Working Families is kind of in the hot seat now for building this independent formation. Give us a sense of, you know, where Working Families is at, what's the opportunity for building an independent party in this moment, and how you all think about the relationship to the Democrats inside all that.
Yes. First, I want to give big ups to Sendolo's Maoist critical reading. If you were my history teacher, school would have been a lot more fun. So appreciate that. I mean, so the question about corporate Dems, right? I think the WFP's kind of origin story, right? We're founded by veterans of the Jesse Jackson campaign, right? In and out of the labor movement, who were dismayed and disgusted by the embrace of neoliberalism by the, you know, Clinton Democratic Party. And so kind of our critical mission has always been to bring voters' attention to the ways that Democrats have been agents of gutting the social welfare state, of increasing privatization, of increasing mass incarceration, so that Democrats are not just able to hide behind the D next to their name, but actually there's a real ideological contest in question. So it has been our practice to defeat Dems in primaries who have most been agents in this neoliberal tilt within the Democratic Party. And that's a strategy that we've used not only in New York, but like our comrades in New Mexico just this year defeated 5 out of 6 of the most conservative Dems in the state Senate on a no corporate Dem platform, right? So this is not just a blue state thing. This is not just a New York state thing. The way to fight neoliberalism is by leading ideologically charged campaigns against neoliberals and winning. Diana Richardson, right, assemblywoman from Brooklyn, ran and won her first race with a pledge to not take real estate dollars, right, with really kind of naming the nefarious role of private entrenched and corporate interests in our politics and the role that real estate is playing in accelerating the displacement of Black and Brown people in Brooklyn and working class people in Brooklyn. And so for us, our party is very much about, one, building the political home that we've all been talking about, that Kristian is talking about building in Texas, right? That we all need, where people are not forced to divorce their values and the urgent needs in their community from a real plan to win, right? As you know, Maurice, right, who's our national director, always talks about, we're not building a delusional third party. People are hungry for victories. People need to see viability, electability. They need to see a real plan to connect the values, the ideology, the needs, the hunger that we have in our communities with a real contest for power at the state level, right? It is our duty to connect those two things and ensure that we're not taking people on a ride, on a purely ideological or purely kind of adventurous ride. And so it's being incredibly strategic about our targets, being incredibly strategic about the opportunities to build and grow our base, having real conversations with voters about how our policies will meet the scale of the crisis, right? To reject the establishment's mode of offering piecemeal tiny measures in response to crisis, right? Voters are far more sophisticated than that and are demanding politics that actually will transform the conditions that we're in and give them real pathways to participation. And so that is what drew me to the party, right? I'm the daughter of West African immigrants who were told time and time again, this country is not ours. And the Democrats somehow think that we are along for a ride with them. And so it's really an intervention moment when we're saying that we want to build a true multiracial cross-class, POC and working class led political machine and movement, right, to contest and dismantle the machine that has not offered any vision or opportunity for us to get ahead as a community. We have to both build more broadly, we have to expand our electorate massively, we have to talk to everyone, we have to reject the algorithms that value some voters over others, that target people based on wealth, voter history, etc. We have to choose candidates under a new model of what is viable, right? The party did not choose Charles Booker or Jamal Bowman as their candidates. We all, I'm sure that can call, knew that they were deeply and profoundly electable, right? And so we have to really reject and throw back these algorithms that send us stale, lukewarm candidates for us to choose between. And so the party, we want to build a space where movements and where people who are fighting for justice on the front lines, whether in the streets or in their communities, can see their visions and desires of their community translated into real political power. The time is now, the urgency is real, and I think the appetite is great. And so we are embracing, bringing everyone in. We need to build this together, but the Democrats are not the solution in this moment.
Let's go, Sochie. Hype us up.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I can, I certainly, you know, I can speak personally and say I appreciate Working Families Party approach to both party building and movement building, right? And not seeing those things as being somehow antagonistic to one another, mutually exclusive. Are there contradictions? Of course. But yeah, but like the necessity is to actually do both at the same time. And so I want to pivot us a little bit to our last question, and then we'll take some audience questions. So this one would be starting with Sendolo, and then Kristian and Sochie, I want to hear from you as well. So one of the central lessons of the 2020 primaries is the centrality of Black political dynamics in the success or failure of being able to build any kind of left project. So how are these uprisings not only changing politics in general, but changing politics in the Black community specifically? And how are y'all seeing the relationship of the Democratic Party to various segments of Black voters? Simple.
I'm like, what can I say that's not going to get me in trouble? So again, I'm like, one of the things that was super frustrating to me during the primary was the way that Black people got talked about as if we're like one thing, and that the Black community is this thing that exists across the entire country. So I want to try to break down what my experience of different political textures in the places that we work in North Carolina. And mostly in the urban areas, I think what I have seen is, on the one hand, there is a very real way that the way white supremacy continues to function politically in our cities is that there are Black representatives who are supposed to be the representative of the community. And they are a part of the local power structures and play a contradictory, but at least towards many of our movements, a constraining role. Now, I think that the uprisings, I don't know if I think that they have transformed Black politics in the places that we do our work. I think they have exposed the fault lines that have been there and have got us into new conversations and new thinking about possibilities. So there's that kind of Black establishment who has a little bit of a pressure on the rest of the local power structure, but really is a part of it. And then I think there's this mass of consistent Black voters who are largely older folks who have a strong feeling and a strong analysis around racism and white supremacy, and take real signals around like what is going to be in the interests of Black folks. Now, the stories about what are in the interest of Black people, I think, are complicated. But I think that that base of people has a strong anti-racist and pro-Black politic. Now, then I think there's a group of younger Black folks. And I would say there's a group of younger Black folks who are more in the kind of professional middle class, many of whom come out of the working class and kind of straddle in that way, who I think are the folks who are the most deeply radicalized in this moment. And are seeking to step into organization in various ways. Sometimes that's into multiracial organization, sometimes that's into specifically Black organization, but that's one layer of people who I see kind of coming into motion. And then there's an overlap of that with just the groups of folks that's pretty broad who are just coming into motion around the protests. And even though there's some overlap between those last two groups, I think there's some real distinction and very different politics that are happening in those different groups of people. And my underlying feeling is that there is a deep absence of permanent organization among Black, progressive, left, and working class folks. Each has their kind of own thing. Like in each of our cities, what we consistently see, we do multiracial organizing. And one of the dynamics that has just consistently come up is actually the desire within our organizations of Black leftists and Black progressives to be like, we don't have our own organization. And that's one of the things that we're trying to hold in tension of like being a multiracial group. But there's a deep longing and a deep absence of that kind of organization. And to me, I'm incredibly inspired by what's happening with the protests. I think it's powerful. I think it's opening up possibilities. I think it's helping people see hope and change. And I do not think it is a substitute for the actual infrastructure of organization among Black working class people and Black progressive folks. And I think until we actually have those organizational structures, the kind of left movement that we want to see won't happen, similar to what Sochie was saying about the labor movement. I think we actually need permanent organizational structures.
I really hope. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I was gonna say, it's hard to follow that. I feel like you definitely touched on what I was gonna say about the importance of really not like diminishing people into, well, one, just as voters, but also just like as a monolith, right? Like, I think when we're talking about people, that requires just so many different elements and intersections of what it means to be that person. And I think sort of moving away from, say, like identity as politics and not identity politics, but identity as politics, to one where we're really like contending with what it means, and what organizations or what like campaigns have been run, and what power has been built locally. I think we're in an interesting position in Dallas where I think about 100% of like top elected officials, as it relates to the police. That's like our DA, our police chief, and our mayor. They're all Black. And so when we're dealing with like a conversation around what does it mean to defund the police, and you're also dealing with like, hey, but it's also like these are Black people that are in these positions that have the ability to like move things and make things happen. And you start to see that contradiction a lot more in that, like, how do you contend with moving away from this idea that any group is a monolith, and be able to actually willingly engage with all of the nuances that come with the conditions that we've been raised in. I think also the struggles that we've endured with other comrades, whether that's in like a multiracial organization, whether that's an explicitly Black or brown organization, or whether it's been no organization and you're just pissed off because of what's happening. And so I think like it's really too soon, obviously, to see what the effect of the uprising is going to have on the dynamics that we're seeing in our cities, obviously, because we're still in the midst of it. But I think that we're definitely already seeing the ways that, and in my mind, I think we're already seeing the ways that these uprisings and the continuation of these uprisings has already instilled a lot of fear into the ruling class. I stand by the notion that I don't think we would have gotten a favorable DACA ruling on the Supreme Court were it not for these uprisings. And so I think that's provided an opportunity for us to talk about how we need to center Black liberation in this moment, while also not forgetting or not like downplaying the idea that there are still people in cages, that there are still ICE detention centers. And because we've largely reduced so many of these issues, I'd say even with immigration, people are always like, oh, it's a brown issue, and largely erase Black immigrants, especially locally, where we have a huge Ethiopian community that was largely affected by a raid in Allen that was one of the largest raids, I think, in the last decade. And again, it's just because there really is sort of like a one-dimensionalizing of us as voters on a national scale. And so the more that we can build with each other and build community with each other, I think that's what it's going to take for us to sort of knock down these misconceptions about what it means to be this type of voter. And I think largely going to throw a lot of the establishment for a loop when they're not really able to sort of pigeonhole us into, this is what they really want. But I think, and I hope that we'll largely see candidates emerge from these communities and these spaces that we're creating, that then largely have a base that's been rooted and largely strengthened by the current uprisings.
Well, I hope that everyone listening goes and listens to this whole discussion a second time, because this is like extremely rich discussion. Thank you all. We have like 10 more minutes or so before we got to cut, and there's been some good questions coming through the chat, so I want to bring in a couple of those. The first one, and this is open, whoever wants to jump in. This is from Jeff Crosby. Do the panelists see a trend towards unification on the left, either amongst the organized left or these sort of progressive statewide coalitions around strategy? So people can take that however they want to take it, but I think there's a question of sort of, is there greater alignment these days and an opportunity for aligned joint action or not? And especially because of what inside outside is, it'd be good to actually sort of talk about this, not just in terms of broadly left progressive forces, but also the organized left. Who wants to take that one?
I'll just say kind of quickly, coming off the heels of primary season in New York, we have seen a real movement towards alignment, more sophistication in terms of kind of a multi institutional left formation, moving towards shared goals, right? With DSA, we had like fantastic partnerships around socialist working families party candidates pushing against corporate Dems, with Justice Democrats, with kind of a whole slew of left organizations who really decide that like it's our moment to contend for power in real ways. We have to strengthen our capacities, complement each other's skills, and also kind of, it's a careful balance of not relying on the strict lanes that I think weaken us, honestly, on the left, right? We have to respect and defer to organizational, institutional, or strategic capacities, but also it's like the lane, like elections are not the lane of the Working Families Party, right? It has to be the lane of the movement for Black Lives and tenants who are organizing, and ethnic organizations who are working to take over and maintain their communities. We actually have to see our party and elections as being doors wide open, and that our role is to make sure that we can absorb all of the energy and kind of help direct people towards shared goals. Elections were not a primary vehicle for the left for many, many years. And so we're all sharpening our knives, right? Like getting skilled up and getting a lot better at running really smart races, and races that are not purely rooted in election cycles, but they're building off the continuous work that movements are doing, right? When we're running a candidate in Rochester, it has to be on the groundwork that tenants there have been fighting for years, right? Or we have to be absorbing the energy that's coming from the movements against police brutality. People have to see the elections as a continuation and as a deepening of the work that we're doing on the ground every day, with a clear view in sight of real governing power. And so I have seen an alignment. I think that we have a lot of space to grow. We have to study and practice together a lot more than we do. We have to ensure that organizations are really open doors and are able to absorb and excite and energize folks who have not been part of the institutional left in many ways. And we have to debrief together, right? We came up with an exciting moment. We have to debrief. We have to evaluate. We have to learn if we're actually meaningfully going to grow. But I think there's tremendous opportunities. All of our organizations are growing. They have to be in the service of a shared and much brighter future.
Great, thank you. And we're in a bit of a lightning round situation, so we can get in as many questions as possible from the audience. So for the next question that's up for grabs from any of y'all is from Anthony. And it's, how are you all wrestling with the integrating a praxis that speaks to cis heteropatriarchy as it intersects with race and class?
I'll say something about that. I think a big part of what we're trying to do with the Carolina Federation is figure out, how do we take these concepts and these frameworks, and particularly the language, and translate it in a way that we think will speak to the kind of felt experiences of large numbers of folks who we're trying to talk to. So in terms of the combination of transphobia, heterosexism, and sexism and misogyny, right? How is it that we have those conversations with our members in a way where they're not like, oh, this is about like some people over there who we have to like not say the wrong thing about, or when we come to this group, we have to say pronouns, and I guess I'll just do that since that's what this group does. But how do we actually have people have a deep experience of the liberating possibilities of queer feminism? And that's something that we're trying to, we're going through some membership recruitment conversations this past week, and had a conversation about one of our core tenets about, we ask for commitment. And as we were talking to our new members, it actually led into this whole conversation about feminist culture of consent, and how actually having an organizing practice of making asks to people based on our understanding of what they really care about and what we want to do together, and listening for yeses and nos isn't just a thing that's about elections. It's not a thing that's just about issue campaigns. It's actually about a kind of culture that we're trying to build that's a feminist culture. And consistently, our members, when we're doing that recruitment process, have lifted up, they said the word consent, out of the conversation of commitment. So we're like, oh, how do we actually integrate that better and be like, what are the experiences of consent that all of our members deeply long for? And then how do we connect that to an explicit feminist politic? We're not there already, but that's one of the places where we're trying to explore the praxis I think you were talking about, Anthony. So it's not just a like, let's give people conceptual framework, but let's pair that with a lived experience of what freedom feels like when we have these frameworks.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, I mean, I know it's hard because you're just like hitting all those points, especially because we live in a society where consent is just not something that we're even accustomed to in just so many ways that we're oppressed under capitalism. But I think that to speak to especially the thing about like creating that relationship, and when we use the term, say, comrade, like making that a liberating and an explicitly political relationship, and by entering into this like consensual political relationship of being a comrade, it also liberates us in a lot of ways of like being able to learn with grace, being able to have like a place where we can struggle together and learn and be transformed through that process. Because I think that's something that often gets, the reputation that is often on the left, right, of like this rigid radicalism that people are afraid to come to meetings because they're going to get, pronouns wrong, or they don't want, they see only like the restrictions and the potential for mistakes. But I think that when we're able to really shift the culture into one that's transformative and feels safe, where people can learn like different ways of seeing the world, different ways to relate to each other, I think then you can lean into a more like liberatory practice of what it means to be in a political relationship with each other. And I think that can then be used to really like engage with these, it applies a transformative experience to all of the elections, the politics, the work that we do together, in a way that I think is not commonplace anywhere else.
Yeah, thank y'all. We gotta stop it right there. But goddamn, are these not some gems that y'all are throwing out right now? And one of the things that I'm thinking about as I move us to close is on one of the comments you were saying, Kristian, is there's oftentimes this intimidating culture about our movements, right? Where people can sometimes experience them as, and that there are even often practices that are, if the motto would be something like, nope, motto's gone. So I'm just going to move to the next thing. Point is, come as you are, transform as you go, right? Should be the kind of culture that we want to be able to build within that. And so, yeah, I just really appreciate all of the just excellence and the brilliance that exists between the three of y'all. And there are just some really good threads around radical consent and building feminist culture, and even things that we couldn't get into around just understanding the nature of the Democratic Party and how does that kind of determine how we relate to the party, what types of alignments that are needed, at state or national level, right? There's just so much that we could get into. But I do want to just let folks know that the Inside Outside Project is going to be doing another one of these calls later this summer. The broad kind of topic will be kind of assessing critical aspects of the current times, and then continuing the theme of how our movements can respond while centering electoral organizing. And I know Rishi is going to tell us a thing.
Yeah, well, thank you again, everyone. It's just really clear. Strategy is not a one and done thing, right? It's not like we have the meeting, we have the retreat, and then everybody has a plan and we just go out about our business. Like, it's actually an unfolding thing, for better or worse. I mean, we should have that retreat, don't get me wrong, but it is an ongoing process. And on this electoral front in particular, the conditions are just changing, the sort of speeding up of social time. Sendolo had a different phrasing, but something like that, the sort of like rapidly changing conditions at a pace that is hard to make sense of, just means we have to be in constant assessment. So tomorrow night, Organizing Upgrade is doing its regularly scheduled program. Its live show on Facebook and YouTube, where we pull apart the 2020 electoral cycle and talk to organizers who are sort of on the front lines. And tomorrow night, we have a special episode where we talk to a senior person inside of the Bernie campaign, Claire Sandberg, who is sort of an major innovator in terms of Bernie's organizing model from 2016 and 2020. But we look at sort of the lessons of the Bernie campaign from the perspective of sort of both the past and current lessons from Black-led political struggle in this country. So we're sort of trying to bring a few traditions together and see what we can learn for the long haul. So please do register for that. I think I put it in the chats of both the Zoom meeting and Facebook. So find it and sign up there.
Yeah, so thank you everyone who's attended on Zoom, on Facebook Live. Thank you to my, again, gorgeous co-moderator, Rishi. Yes, come on, everybody strike a vote. Our great panelists, again, who were Sochie, Nnaemeka. Can you say it so everyone knows how to say it?
You got it before, Whitney. Sochie,
I know.
Nnaemeka.
Sochie, Nnaemeka. Beautiful, of Working Families Party, Sendolo, Diaminah of the Carolina Federation, and Kristian Hernandez of Democratic Socialists of America. good night, and continue to kick ass and take names of the enemy.
Peace, folks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Y'all.